Hey guys, John here again, and today we're going to take a look at some of the later areas in Dark Souls 3. We've heard a lot of talk about the performance problems turning up later in the game, with some users referring to these areas as the Blight Town of Dark Souls 3. With a title like that, how could we not take a look? So the first thing to note here is that we're using version 1.03 of the game for these tests. Based on our findings, there is a significant improvement to performance when using the latest patch, which you can see here in this very early section of the game. Frame pacing is terrible in both cases, but the actual frame rate can drop much lower in version 1.01. Okay, now before we move on to the actual tests, we should warn you that the areas being shown in this video do contain areas from later in the game. There isn't really any other way to put the game to the test without showing these spots after all, but if you're sensitive to location spoilers, do take caution. Now, onwards. The first area we've heard so much about is Faron Keep. Yes, it's another Souls game with a swamp full of poisonous muck. What, did you think they were going to leave out the poison swamp in this game? I don't think so. It's entirely possible that version 1.01, which users were discussing over the last few weeks, actually did run rather poorly here, but in its current iteration, the frame rate really isn't all that different from anywhere else in the game. We do see minor drops below 30 frames per second at certain points, sure, but we're generally looking at a pretty stable level of performance here. The real problem remains frame pacing, which continues to plague the game, leading to the impression of performance dips throughout. Based on our earlier results when pitting version 1.01 against version 1.03, we can imagine that drops into the mid-20s were actually quite common in this area initially. Thankfully, new players to the game won't have to worry about this now. Moving into the next area, we see similar results once more. Occasional dips below 30 frames per second combined with improper frame pacing. Now, when you combine these elements together, you can end up with something that does feel pretty jerky, but the actual reported numbers aren't actually that low here. Of course, when the game does slow down, it seems to run somewhat in slow motion, which only serves to exacerbate the issue. Alright, let's move on to the final area here, Lothrop Castle. This is the spot where we uncovered the most issues. Throughout this area, we actually found plenty of drops just below 30 frames per second, usually hovering in the 28 or 29 FPS zone. This, when combined with the improper frame pacing once again, as well as an actual drop in gameplay speed, definitely give the impression that the game just isn't running properly. Honestly, between all of this, I think it's pretty clear that Dark Souls 3 demonstrates the importance of proper frame pacing more than any other recent game. Even when delivering 30 frames per second, the variation in frame persistence can give the impression of slower overall performance. The game just feels jerky as a result of this, and it's pretty disappointing. For those that aren't up to speed on why frame pacing matters, consider this. On a 60Hz display, 60 frames per second can be achieved when each frame persists for 16.7 milliseconds. When targeting 30 frames per second then, you can think of it as a set of unique and duplicate frames where frame 1 will be a unique frame, while frame 2 is just a duplicate of frame 1. When taken together, these two frames should remain on screen for exactly 33 milliseconds before the next frame is displayed. When the frame pacing is incorrect, however, we end up with this. Frames 1 and 2 will be identical and persist on screen for 33 milliseconds as we suggested above, but when the next frame is shown then, you might actually have two duplicates following instead of just one, meaning that the next image will actually persist for 50 milliseconds instead. Then the frame after that will attempt to make up for this and only appear on screen for 16.7 milliseconds. With every frame appearing on screen for different lengths of time, the end result is a perceptible microstutter. These results become rather obvious when the PS4 version is placed up against the PC version. When these frame persistence errors arise on the console, the game becomes noticeably less fluid. It's a real shame too, as Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 remain two of the only titles with this issue where the developer has simply refused to acknowledge or address it. And it's not an uncommon problem. When the Destiny beta first hit, for instance, it had improper frame pacing, and well, Bungie fixed it. Need for Speed Rivals launched with it, and guess what? It was also fixed immediately. In fact, the only other game that comes to mind with this frame pacing issue that still hasn't been fixed is the 2014 release of Thief. The fact is, if these problems were addressed, Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 could feel much smoother than any of the last generation From Software titles. But, well, as it stands, they currently feel worse, and we believe that this has led some users to believe that the frame rate is even lower than it seems. Okay, so there's one more thing we wanted to address. You may be wondering why we've only been showing PlayStation 4 footage for this test. We do love Dark Souls here, but this is not a trivial game to blitz through. Both Tom and I are currently playing through the game, but we're nowhere near the end. Thankfully, on PlayStation 4, it's possible to share saves with other users, which enabled us to borrow a colleague's late game save for testing purposes. On Xbox One, however, this just isn't possible, and we haven't made it far enough in the game to actually test these areas. Hopefully, at some point in the future, we'll be able to take a look at that version as well. Anyways, that's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and until next time, this is John signing off to go play more Dark Souls 3.